About 30 years ago, huge historical events reshaped Europe, bringing democracy and freedom to many nations in the Central and Eastern Europe. It is my pleasure and honor to talk about those events and the legacy of democratic revolutions with Anna Kaminsky, director of the Federal Foundation for the Reappraisal of the SED dictatorship in Eastern Germany. Hello, Anna.
Hello, Sergei.
Thank you for joining us.
Nice to meet you. Thank you very much.
You have also a personal touch with the fall of Berlin Wall. As long as I remember, you were in Berlin at that day, right?
Unfortunately, at that date, I was not in Berlin. I was in Leipzig. And as nobody announced that the Berlin Wall will fall down this night, I knew it the other day. But as I lived in Berlin all the times, I could see the consequences of the fall of the wall immediately.
Can you describe those feelings, your feelings as a German citizen?
You know, growing up in a dictatorship and knowing that communist leaders and communist party defended their power by all means, and we all lived it, we all have seen it throughout communist times, I couldn't believe it. I said it was a fake news. Because Honecker, the East German dictator, he said some weeks before the fall of the wall, he said, the wall will stand here in 50 and 100 years. So when people said, you know, you have to go to Berlin back, wall is open, I said, yeah, it's a nice joke. And I thought they tried to provoke me, to provoke a reaction, and that after that, my reaction, they would put me to prison or something like that. And then I realized that it was not a joke, that it was real. And my fear was that they opened up the wall for 1 day, 1 week, 1 month, and then they will shut it down again. They will imprison us again. But fortunately, I was not right, and I'm so happy about that.
If we talk more generally, how do you assess those events from 1989 to 1991 in Europe? What is your kind of opinion about those processes in general, what they brought us?
For me, it's a logical consequence of all resistance acts and all opposition and dissident movements which accompanied communist dictatorship all over the time. Because if we remember today, uprisings were shut down at every time. Uprisings accompanied the Soviet Union since 1917 when communists came to power. Uprisings accompanied communist empire after 1945, in 1953 in Czech Republic and in the GDR, in 1956 in Hungary, in 1968 in Poland and Czech Republic again. There were actions in the Baltic states all over the time, in Ukraine. And in all over the Soviet Empire, we find these oppositional movements, and we find strikes, we find uprisings, even that most of these events were not published and were not public or common property, because communist dictators tried to hide the information about these Protestant acts. And in 1989 and 1991, for me, it's a logical consequence of all these tries which accompanied communist dictatorships to overcome the dictatorships. So in 1989 and until 1991, in most of the communist-ruled countries, people achieved it. In the Baltic states, after uprisings and attempts to shoot down the demonstrations by Soviet army, in the GDR and other countries by peaceful demonstrations. But all these attempts to overcome dictatorship and achieve democracy were powerful demonstration of the unbeatable wish and hope of people to live in freedom, to have civil rights, to have democracy, and to live in a state of law. And for many people in the East, this was also named our return to Europe, because by communist division of the world, by the Cold War, by the Iron Curtain, people behind the Iron Curtain in the East, they were cut up from Europe. And so these years and the overcome of communism were in every country accompanied by great expectations and hopes.
Before the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, both systems, the democratic and the communist socialist system, offered a kind of a way of life with different bonuses, with different possibilities to build a career. Of course, they were really different, and the environment, political environment, was absolutely different. Democratic, pluralistic society and closed society of castes, of party membership, but still, they both were kind of offering everything that a person could possibly need. But why do you think the communist offer actually was overthrown and not accepted in the end of the day by most of the people?
Communists pretended to give people a kind of social safety, of social equality, a kind of social justice. But what people lived in communist states was the opposite. Communist states took nearly all freedoms from people. They took private property from people. They cut up freedom of movement. They cut nearly all freedoms. And in the example of communist dictatorships and communist states, we can see that human beings are more than people who want to eat and drink and have a house. And the other thing is that people could see abroad how life can be, and life in socialist countries was far away from that image that people wanted for themselves, for their families, for their neighbors and friends. And what we can see that freedom is a very high value, and lack of freedom is probably the most hurtable value that people might lack. So I think the social system communism is offering to people is not convincing, and it was demonstrated over 70 years of proving that. And if we look now to the world, to Venezuela, to what might be happening in Peru, what is happening in Nicaragua, what is still happening in North Korea and Cuba, we can see that in nearly every country, we can see that the communist model is not what people normally want.
Let's talk about a present, about the legacy of the communist dictatorships. Many social scientists are pointing out that some social, economic and also political processes in those countries which had the experience of the Red dictatorship, those processes are kind of having a tail from that old time of the Red dictatorships, because the people's mentality living many generations under oppression and in a closed society, this mentality doesn't go out of the room immediately. It stands and sometimes goes opposing on kids too, the new generation. Just in your practical life, do you see this kind of ghosts of the Soviet mentality still influencing the society today?
Yes, for sure. because there were, in case of the Soviet Union, there were 5 or 6 generations which grew up with the mentality, with the ideology of communism. And even in the post-war communist states like Germany or Poland or the Baltic states, we have 2 or 3 generations which grew up behind the Iron Curtain, which grew up confronted with communist ideology, with communist values. And it's natural that there are consequences of this, because people don't change their minds, don't change their behaviors like a trouser. They live with that. And we all were educated in this sense. But on one hand side, a lot of people opposed against that, because if not, 1989 and 1991 wouldn't have been possible on one hand side. But on the other hand side, in nearly all former communist countries, we have a kind of nostalgia, a kind of fame of the past, that life was much easier than today, that restrictions were bearable, and some values are played out against each other. It is said social safety was much higher than today, but often it is said that it's capitalism which is responsible for the drastic transformations of economy and poverty and misery, which a lot of people in Eastern Europe had to suffer after breakdown of communism. But what a lot of people does not see is that this is a consequence of mistreatment, of miseconomy in communist times, and that after 1991, 1989, what we live, that these are consequences of what communism did to the countries and to the people.
Do you feel that the influence of the communist past is now more than 30 years after slowly dying, and now we are getting free from that slowly? Because sometimes, since I was born, of course, about 30 years ago here in Estonia, I remember those 1990s when Estonia looked like Soviet country in many ways. And then, being already a young guy, I started to see how this thing is changing and transforming. And I must say that many topics that were extremely painful, historical topics, 20 or 15 years ago now are for many people absolutely irrelevant.
Yeah. What I see are two contradictory developments. On the one hand side, nostalgia for communist regime, for the real existing socialist countries, is decreasing. People, I think it's only a small minority of people who wishes to get back in former times. But what we also can see is that there's a great wish and hope for social justice. And a lot of people mistrust in democracy's ability to give social justice. And so what we can see, for instance, in France or in other countries, that we have a growing leftist movement, and that there are also included some elements from communist ideology. For instance, here in Germany, we have a great debate of expropriations of property in apartments and houses. So, and there's a young generation who thinks that socialist ideas are practical to resolve people and mankind's problems we have to face in the next decades.
You pointed out that there are some tensions in the electorate about kind of this political agendas. How about those people who actually tear down the wall by themselves, or stood in the Baltic Way from Tallinn to Vilnius, or risked with their lives when the dictatorships made the last attempts to survive? And many of those people who I just mentioned 30 years ago vote for autocratic populist parties. They kind of absolutely turned themselves away from many ideals that they defended 30 years ago. Do you agree with this, that there is a problem like this? And if yes, how do you think why this is happening?
If you look at the surveys from a communist party now named leftist party here in Germany, they only have 7% of the votes. So I don't think that this is really an up-to-date problem, because large majority, at least in Germany, is voting for democratic parties. It's more or less 80% of people who are voting for parties from the center, from the middle of society. Though I don't think that this is a large problem, but what we have to see 30 years after the fall of the wall, that what was declared in 1990, 1991, the end of history, and that values of liberalism would conquer the world. Now we can see that this was a dream, that this was too optimistic. We don't live in a world like that. We have new problems. We have new extremisms we have to face, and that liberal democracies have to be straight in their fight against all kinds of extremism, left or right, or from religion funded. It does not matter what kind of extremism are attacking liberal democracies. We have to fight all, because the base of all is very similar: to fight against democratic rights, to undermine democratic values, to undermine personal and social freedoms. So we have to be aware of that, and that situation is changed 30 years after coming down communism.
If we talk about historical narratives in Europe, it's also always a kind of important and hot topic, because we have a situation where half of Europe formulated a clear condemnation upon communist and national socialist dictatorships, and other part of Europe mostly formulated strong condemnation upon National Socialism. It is because different states had different experiences during 30s and 40s and 50s and so on. And Germany stands just on the center of this debate, because Germany, like many other states, had long experiences with both. How do you see this problem from the perspective of your work? Is the crimes of communism being more realized in Europe?
You know, the division of Europe after or during Cold War and with Iron Curtain also meant for many people in Europe that we have a divided history, and we have divided experiences. The experience of National Socialist totalitarianism is an experience that is shared by all Europe, because the German Nazis invaded all Europe. So here we have a common experience. On behalf of communism, there we have a divided experience. Only only people and countries behind Iron Curtain lived real communist dictatorships. So this experience is a natural experience in the East, but it's not a common experience in the West. And so, on one hand side, it's logical that we have we have a divided history and we have a divided experience, and so we have also a divided feeling or knowledge or conscience about what communism means. But when we live in Europe on similar values, on shared values of civil rights and democratic rights and freedom, then all Europe has to find a way to remember both totalitarian regimes, because it's the experience of this double experience of totalitarianism is part of the lives of nearly half of European citizens. And for Europe's future, this has to be included. And if we look at the House of History, of European History in Brussels, they made a good attempt to include and to show how Europe developed in these two different, let's say, worlds. On one hand side, the liberal world based on freedom and democratic and civil rights in the West, and the other part of the world after 1945 based on communist ideology with all its consequences.
How do you think what should be made by educators and historians and foundations like the one you are managing to have in some time a possibility to say that we as a Europe say never again to both biggest totalitarian ideologies of the past century?
Yeah, first of all, base of all our activities is to spread out knowledge. What we need is knowledge about our history, about our shared and divided history in Europe in the last century, and to know what other countries suffered, what other countries lived in this time. And this is one of the lacks in Europe in the last decades, that after the fall of the wall, there were only a spotlight on what is communism and what did communism in the East. But then nearly all countries came back to daily affairs. And to deal with the communist past was widely seen as a regional problem in the East and not as part of the common history of Europe. So what we need is that in East and West and North and South, people know about Europe's history. And here in Germany, we have also the point that a lot of people in schools, that are young school children, they have to know about that Germany was divided and why it was divided, that it was a consequence of the Second World War started by Nazi Germany, and that in the consequence of this murderous war, Germany was divided, and that it also ended in a divided continent in which one part was ruled by communist Soviet Union. So we don't have to forget this, but we should also remember, and people should know about, what does it mean to live under communist rule.
Anna, I would like to ask.
This is, in my eyes, and this is, in my eyes, the most important question to give information about that, and that is a normal, or not. It's not the right word. That this should be an important part of public education, to know what happened in the last 70 years in our countries, and what formed and what is the base of what we are living today. What is forming our history? What is forming our past?
Anna, I would like to also ask you a bit more, maybe a personal question. Now looking back at those times when the Berlin Wall fell and new huge possibilities for each of the people who lived at the time emerged, your personal desires, wishes of that time, if you remember them, are they now reality for you? Did your dreams come true?
Yes. With a clear yes.
And did you dream about being in the position you are now?
No, never. No, never. No, what I wanted to do was, during communist time, I felt out of the system. I did not work. I was not part of the system. So what I dreamed on was to research, to write books, and I knew that during communist time, it would never be possible. Maybe I can write, but it would never have been published. And so after 1990, I could start with that. That I would be in the position I am now as a director of such foundation, I never dreamed on, because I couldn't imagine that there would be such a foundation with these incredible possibilities to realize books, publications, public debates about the huge question: what are the differences between democracy and dictatorship, and in which world we want to live? And so I'm very happy that I got the chance to do that.
How about the next generations? Those kids who are today in the kindergartens, do you believe that they will live in a wealthier, healthier, and more secure Europe than you live now at the moment?
I hope so. I hope so, and I think yes, they will do, and it's also up to us to ensure that they will live in such a Europe, and that we have to resolve the problems of European Union, and I think yes, we have to debate with people, and we have to make clear what are the differences between democratic states and dictatorial or authoritarian systems, and I know that the only weapons we have are arguments and discussions, and to stand in debates, and not to hide us and to avoid discussions. Because one time, it was in 1990 or 1991, somebody said to me, "You know what democracy is about?" And I said, "Yeah, more or less, I know." And he said, "Democracy is a noisy place." And for me, all this image, this picture, it's a noisy place. It was always a kind of inspiration for me to say, if we don't have debates, if we don't have discussion, it is dangerous for democratic states. We have to debate, and democracy gives us the space to discuss problems, and also to stand discrepancies we have. Because democracy does not mean that all is nice.
That's true. You as a historian, and actually the huge value of historical education and research is a possibility using your knowledge to see parallels between different events, also knowing the psychology of people. Sometimes being a historian, you can a bit predict. I know that historians don't like this word because historians are dealing with the past and there is nothing to predict there anymore, but still, some people say that there are some really frightening parallels. I mean the political and social processes in some parts of Europe that a bit can be seen as trying again to do something that Europe tried to do in 20s and 30s, and then it brought totalitarianism and authoritarianism. So a bit, the weakening of democracy and trying again to believe in a strong hand. In, I don't know, 20 or 30 years, do you believe that Europe will be still mostly democratic and liberal as it is now?
I don't know if the countries will be like right now. But what I hope is that in 30 or 40 years we still live in Europe and maybe in more countries in the world based on liberal democratic values. This I believe and I'm convinced and I hope that Europe will be able to maintain that and also to overcome some attempts or attacks to say we need a strong hand, because I don't think that we need a strong hand. We need a strong democracy and we need strong democratic institutions. But that also needs democrats which are able to convince people that these values are worth to live for it and are worth to defend these values against attacks.
Anna, with this positive feeling of hopefully having a great future for this continent, I would like to thank you for joining us, for having this conversation. Thank you.
I thank you, Sergei. Yeah, and I really hope that we in all Europe, not only in the European Union, we may live in really democratic conditions, because I, as somebody who lived dictatorship, I don't wish to anybody that they really have to live. What does that mean? So I hope that together we are able to defend democratic rights and democratic basis for all what we do and what we have to live, and also the future generations, and that they also may estimate what democracy is.
And your work
even that
is
they
really
don't
important.
have a direct comparison.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sergei.